Well, hello, this is Liam from Evolve Cyber. I'm joined with Jason Simmons and Andrew Brett. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Today, we are talking about the riveting subject of regulation and litigation. If you listen to our previous episode, we had a wealth of knowledge uncovered in that conversation. And today, we will continue down a similar track, but we're going to pivot over a little bit more to regulation and laws and things like that. So thank you, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm really excited to get into this episode.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Liam. Likewise.
No worries at all. All right, well, I'm going to kick it off. And this is going to, Jason, you're going to love this question because there's so much ambiguity to it. So for business leaders, they may or may not be aware that there are rules and regulations around reporting data breaches. Now, as you'll probably tell us, there's a lot of different scenarios and different things that apply. But I wanted to ask a question. If I, as a business leader, was to have a cyber breach, do I have to report it? And what would happen if I don't?
Yeah, sure. Maybe, and maybe. So there's a nice clear answer for you to start off the pod, Liam.
100%.
Firstly, we've covered in an earlier pod, what's a data breach, and so if people have listened to that one, they'll know that data breaches are only notifiable under privacy law in Australia when it's considered a defined type of data breach known as an eligible data breach under Part 3C of the Privacy Act. And within that part of the legislation, it actually sets out a test as to when an organisation that's regulated by the Privacy Act, a regulated entity, essentially one that earns more than $3 million a year, but there's I won't get into the complexity about when an entity is regulated or not, but essentially that's sort of the bottom line. And then when an incident occurs, we look at, has there been a data breach which satisfies this test? And if so, yes, notification to the regulator and to individuals impacted is mandatory. If you fail to comply with those obligations, you're at risk of being investigated if the regulator were to learn about this data breach and come to the view that it should have been notified to the regulator and to individuals. And through that investigation process, you could find yourself subject to some sort of initially the OEIC, the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, making declarations or recommendations against you, which may include the payment of compensation to the individuals impacted, and it may include a penalty of some kind under various sections of the Privacy Act, depending on the seriousness of what you failed to do. And so it's quite a process there. It's not the case of fail to notify and once you pass go you'll suddenly receive you'll receive an instant fine, but it is getting closer to that kind of reality because we've seen just at the end of last year the Privacy Act got amended to include infringement notice powers for our commissioner, which means she now has the ability in certain circumstances to effectively book you with a speeding fine kind of infringement notice. The fine is much smaller than the ones found elsewhere in the Act, but nonetheless, it's now getting to the point where if you don't comply with your obligations under the Privacy Act, you can find yourself faced with potential fines and penalties of various tiers or seriousness, and something you need to be mindful of if you're considering sticking your head in the sand.
Yeah. And just before we go any further, I would love to ask, just off the back of that, again, putting myself in the mind of a business leader who may not know. You mentioned earlier you're not going to get into the topic of regulated industries, whether you know or not. Is there somewhere where potentially a business leader could go or start on the journey to learn if they are an entity that sits under the Privacy Act and or if they're quote unquote regulated, just to start the journey? I mean, I know there's a lot of moving parts, but if someone was like, I don't know right now if that applies to me, where could they start?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's fantastic information that's available for free on the OAIC's website. They
Mm,
go into great length as to who the Privacy Act applies to. They provide examples, but probably the most important things to think about are, um, do I earn revenue over a financial year of $3 million or more, potentially?
mm,
Don't be cute with that figure if you're close. Um, am I declaring to the world on my website through a privacy policy that I'm going to uphold to the Privacy Act? That's
mm,
another way that you might have done that because at some point in the creation of your business and running it, you thought it was appropriate to have a privacy policy linked on your website. But then, if I've then said to you, "Oh, you don't earn 3 million, you only earn 1 million a year," if you've declared to the world that you're going to uphold the Privacy Act, potentially that then means you are required to do so because you've effectively made a statement to your customers that you would. So that's the second type. And then I would say that, again, going to the information that's for free on the IRC website, there's certain instances where no matter how much you earn a year, you have to comply with the Act. And that might,
mm,
in particular, accountants are one that comes up all the time for me because they hold tax file numbers for their clients, and they're a
yeah.
separately regulated type of information where effectively the Act says if you're collecting TFNs on behalf of your clients, and then you have a data breach which impacts those TFNs, we don't care if you've only earned $1 million that year. You actually have to consider whether that's a notifiable data breach. And
Mm,
lastly, and probably what I should have said at the beginning, if you're an organization that holds personal information of your
mm,
clients beyond just names and addresses, the basic contact details, but you start heading into the more sensitive things, health information, passports, credit card numbers, driver's license. Can I implore organizations that are earning less than the 3 million to consider pretending as though they have to comply with the Privacy Act reporting obligations? Because my
mm,
experience, having done hundreds of incidents, customers don't often care if you turn around and say, "Oh, sorry, I didn't tell you about that data breach a few months ago. I only earned 2.2 million last year, and so that meant I wasn't required to tell you."
yeah.
Customers tend to respond by saying, "Well, I'm not really interested in continuing to do business with you." So it's often it's often a case where we'll advise an organisation that technically you don't have to report this incident, but for your revenue you would have. Do you want to proceed nonetheless? And here's the benefits of doing so, but here's the consequences of doing so as well. And I find that the majority of time organisations are telling me I want to notify anyway.
Mm. 100%. That's fantastic. You touched on a couple of really great points there. I was smiling before when you were talking about accountants and tax file numbers because I had an argument with an accountant once, and he was arguing till he was blue in the face that because it's not explicitly stated on the website that accountants are under, because they store TFNs, he's okay. And I was like, yeah, you still have TFN numbers, you still collect that information, but apparently I was wrong. So a little bit validating for me there.
Yeah, and the confusing part too, mate, just to extend that point, because often people look at the TFN sort of obligation too narrowly as well. When you hold TFNs on behalf of customers, it then opens you up to having to consider the entire data breach and how you're obligated to notify anybody that you're holding those TFNs for. It's not just a case of if you hold the TFNs and it's only like the number and a name and someone and what I find is that people interpret the data breach too narrowly of those tax file numbers. You actually need to then incorporate all the other information that you hold about those people to determine whether you should be notifying or not. And
Mm.
99% of the time, if you're holding TFNs for someone, it's probably because you've got a whole tax return that you've prepared for them, and it's going to have a whole other range of PI in there, and so it's going to require notification. So I think, in speaking with that accountant, they've got to realise that it's not just the fact that you're holding a tax file number for that person. You're now holding a cache of personal information that criminals can combine to really do some damage, and it needs to
Mm.
come. You need to have that mindset when you're a TFN holder, as opposed to trying to like weasel your way out of not reporting obligations because you feel as though storing TFNs alone shouldn't be enough. It's the legislation is intentional in how it deals with TFNs, and so unfortunately, it means a lot of small business accounting firms and have to comply with these obligations.
Mm. Yeah, that's thank you for expanding on that a little bit more. That's very educational. And I hope anyway listeners who listen to this do get a lot of value out of this, because even just for me, I'm like, that's amazing.
If I can just jump in there for an example of what I really changed, just what changed my outlook on it is, I remember talking to someone. They said, a lot of people out in the sort of general public think these scams are attacking your actual credit card, whereas what he sort of reminded me was personal information can be used to create a whole new credit card. So
Yeah.
a credit card you never knew existed, and that one you're not going to have any visual outlook over. So the only time you're going to know about it is when the credit report comes in eventually and says this credit card was maxed out, it hasn't been paid, and you need to essentially it's created under your name with all the details, all the personal identifiable details, and yeah, it's that really opened it up for me because you can't actually see it
Mm.
until it's a long way down the line.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other one that I get all the time, which I just face palm at, is, "Oh, it's all right, mate. They've already got all my details. So what's one more?" I'm like, no, that is not a great approach to that.
I was going to say, yeah, what's one more? Well, it could be the one where, the criminal that's now got that one more piece of information has a particular business model that targets, financial scams that they're quite experienced in. So you might have had a
Mm.
couple of incidents where a criminal was just a phishing specialist that just wanted to fish more and more contacts over and over again. And finally, they got that last piece of the puzzle that enabled them to undertake some ATO refund scams or something like that. And you might find yourself in a predicament where a half a dozen of your clients has suddenly not received refunds because they've fallen for some social engineering, and you've just been a bit lazy about, oh well, they just got one more thing. Well, that one more thing could have been the time when a particular criminal group found you a target that they were happy to have a go at, and that's the one that brings you unstuck and really hurts you. So I get it. I I have friends and family who often criticize me around, what's the big deal? Like, we had the big ones a couple of years ago, and now I get an email or a letter notifying me every 2 months about another one, and can't we all just kind of like deal with it? And I try and explain to people that the risk that existed even though that 2 or so years ago is so much greater now because of the criminals' ability to use that data for so many
Mm.
more sophisticated scams. We weren't talking about deep fakes 2 years ago. We weren't talking about the ability of people to be not only created digitally to get a loan or something, but they can create you. Um, And so it needs to be thought as it, what was 2 years ago is not the same anymore. And I find too that unless someone's personally experienced what having to go through an identity scam and dealing with bad credit ratings and things like that come out of it, or getting their passport replaced or license replaced. Once you've done that once, you don't want to do it again. So, yeah, look, I understand the sentiment. I just like to try and convince people we're giving in to the criminals. They want you to be lazy. Like that is
Yes.
exactly what they're hoping for.
Yep. On both sides of that, both from a dealing with a scam and as an individual, but also from the perspective of a business who's not doing the right things to
Mm.
protect themselves.
Yeah, and I think that's like the hard part about a business is. So we had an example where an older gentleman, again, it's these sort of white collar businesses. He sort of was declaring his PIIs, or personally identifiable information, and he's sort of going, the usual. Oh, mate, I wouldn't have much. Probably 10 or 20,000, and then that's his or that's his perception. I think we ended up. He was closer to. By the time we finished, he was closer to 900,000, because what he didn't realize was that his business was 20 something years old. He hadn't actually been deleting anything, so he'd had everything still there, but also he just again, his perception was that it wouldn't be much. It's like most things. Oh, it wouldn't be much. And then the sort of reality when it's all out on a blueprint, they're going, wow. And then, as you talk about, what Jason just said before, having to change a passport. Well, when you have 900,000 PIIs, yeah, it might be 10 PIIs per person, but it still could be, 9,000 people having to change their passport, 9,000 people that these scammers go, "You beauty, this is fantastic. Let's get this treasure trove of information." So,
Yeah.
we met. You met with, as Jason said, all three of us actually. You met with pushback every day, and I think it's just because people haven't really been stung, or haven't they haven't really felt the pain of the reality,
Yeah.
which is unfortunate. But,
Yeah. And that's the biggest frustration I have, is the fact that it's never going to happen to me, so I'll be fine. But we all know in this room that prevention is the best approach to stopping these events from happening. I think,
yeah.
just to jump off the back of what you're saying there, Andrew, there's two things that I wanted to comment on from that particular example that you had. I think businesses struggle to obtain an appetite for what PII they're holding. That I see with businesses at the moment, where we run Pi scanners as part of what we do, just for the sake of visibility and understanding. What do you have? Once you have an idea of what you have, then okay, what do we need to do to secure it? What reasonable steps? Things like that, right? The first, I think, one of the biggest issues is there's no easy way to tell. That you
Mm.
can't just flick something on and go, "There's my figure." Even with those figures, then you also need, I've used a number of different solutions, and it's not 100% accurate as well. What one of them in particular was mistaking a whole bunch of invoices as driver's license information. I was like, "Well, hold on a minute, that's so that's the first issue. And then the second issue with that is, I have conversations all the time with people where they're like, we don't know, or maybe we in this area we need to keep data for this amount of period. In this area we don't know. So what are we going to do? We're just going to keep everything all the time, because then from a regulation perspective, we're all good. If we keep it past the 8 years or the 7 years, then we're all good. Which I can understand from that perspective, because the financial information's one thing. I think there's, from an employment law perspective, there's a whole other retention rules and stuff like that. So I think that is also the difficulty of that as well.
I think what people are, we talk about costs. How does it cost this much? It's actually, a lot of the time, the digital forensics, having to go and find and map it out, because you can't ring up Gary and say, "Gary, we lost your information," and then not tell him exactly what you lost. Because if you
Mm,
sort of, you want to do the right thing, and I think, you know, I always tie it back to cyber insurance. Two things with the digital forensics and both that and the PR and legal. So it's three things. It's before going to have a chat with Gary and saying we've lost your stuff. There's a way to approach him, but it also takes time to map out your network, especially after you've been hit or popped, depending on what language you want to use. It's and then the reality of the nature is these people they're not general professionals. I mean, most of them are $400-500 an hour. So every hour they're looking, and it could take weeks. It's just, and you might have 3 or 4 people, depending on the size of your corporation. So I just think it's one of those things. What we as you said, it's so hard when a house is on fire. We can all see the fire. I mean, theoretically, you and I could grab a hose and help. Whereas with these kind of incidents, like you need to go find it, and you need people that know how to go do that. It's fascinating, Liam. Honestly, when as the 3 of us, we're on the other side. We've seen them.
Yeah, it's a fun time at the moment, and
I think it's the other thing. It's hard because company X is paying out $40,000 for Google SEO campaigns, yet you ask them for $10,000, $15,000 for a bit of cybersecurity, and it's met like asking for their firstborn. I think the mentality around sort of and the irony is the 40,000 of SEO might not even yield anything, but I think when you talk about attitudes and excitement and all that stuff. I mean, as Jason said, there's a few companies out there that are doing the right thing, going, look, we're not over 3 mil, but I think it's important to our company that we do act like we do. And when you do see them, you sort of, you're really excited because you're like, that's a great attitude. But there's a lot that are over 3 mil that aren't even ticking a box.
I've had a recent sort of run of matters for smaller businesses, and it's not unusual for small businesses, particularly in professional services, to be eyeing in the future to sell or merge your business with others. And one of the key components of any due diligence process for the sale, merger of corporations is, have you had a data breach and how did you handle it? And if you're an organisation worth less than $3 million and you've been a victim of a cybercrime, you are caught in a bind if you are asked to declare whether you've had one or not in the last 5 years. And you say yes, and then the obvious next question is, well, provide us with relevant documentation around the process following that incident. And all you've got to show for it is an email from IT saying we've updated the passwords, we turned on MFA, and we're good to go. And as far as you know, you have absolutely no idea whether that actor was ever removed from your network, whether there was further fraud conducted. It doesn't look good. And so I'm often telling organisations that you might be where you are now in terms of your cyber risk appetite and your willingness to buy cyber insurance or uplift your security, and I understand that. But if you're eyeing in the future to greater things, data breaches, ransomware attacks, and other cyber incidents are very much a part of M&A world now. And so you want to be one of those organizations that handles an incident well, because gone are the days when just having a data breach is like, oh, we don't want to buy that company now because they had a data breach. We're beyond that now. We get it. Anyone can be a victim, particularly where organizations just, we make mistakes or there's a vulnerability that was taken advantage of, blah, blah, blah. And so you're not suddenly out of the deal. It's the next phase. It's the how did you manage it? And you want to be an organisation turning around that says, look, yeah, we engage with our insurers and they're specialists, and we notified and our customers were happy, and here's the documentation and moving on. I can tell you right now that is gonna go down a lot better than the alternative that I talked about before. So I think that's probably something that's not talked about much
And it's interesting too, you say that. There's 2 parts to that, Jason, that really makes my mind go off. And I love this conversation we're having. Actually, it's very flavoring us. There's so many sort of golden nuggets. I mean, I've had pushback from, well, what's the point in doing all this if I keep reading that as soon as you have an incident, you're done. You're over. So why would I bother doing all this if I'm just going to be over anyway? And it's, as you said, that might have been years ago. That might have been the sentiment. And to be honest, everyone likes to throw around the 60% of businesses won't survive a cyber incident.
Yeah.
But I think if you're sort of pushing to, as you sort of said, Jason, you can still, doing all this preventative or lessening measures, we're moving past that sort of stage of, it's just one hit and you're out. If you've done the right thing, there is absolutely coming back from it. And the second part that came out of your first point was I think of it, and we see it all the time because we purchased a house recently, is an analogy, sorry, for the business owners that want to put it in context. It's like never doing any maintenance on your house and then going to get top dollar, and someone gets a building report and they're going, well, actually, this you want 1.8 mil, argument's sake, but there's probably about 300 grand worth of work this new purchaser is going to do that, and they're going, well, actually, no, I banked on the fact that I was going to get 1.8 million because I need to, buy the next house and I wanted to buy a boat, because we're downsizing, and then they go, no, you're probably more looking like 1.5, and also I want 100 grand off because I don't really want to do this. I'll just go buy another property that's actually already finished. So, the stat that came out the other day that, with the aging population, is going to be a lot of sort of mergers and acquisitions over the next sort of 5-10. Well, imagine where we are going to be in 5 or 10 years. If you're not doing anything now, what's that golden goose or this business you worked on for so long? Is it going to be, is it going to be, well, you haven't done anything for 5-10. You either do it all now, and even then we're kind of skeptical about this because we've got 4 businesses on our table that we're making offers on, and the other 3 have. And the opposite of, okay, well, this is very healthy. You've had a good attitude towards it. This is a blue chip business.
Yeah, agreed, mate.
Yeah, that's a incredibly great thing that, like you just said, Jason, I wasn't even aware of the M&A side of things. It's going to be very interesting. Just where I know we're almost coming up to time here, I wanted to ask a couple more questions really quickly. From a fines and penalties perspective, Jason, I know we touched on it kind of at the start. From as high level as possible, and again, I know it depends on situations. From what I understand, there's a couple of different levels of fines versus penalties, as you alluded to. If you could just run us through that, and why I would love to know is, we see in the news back when I think it was Medibank or Optus had their data breach, there was a cap of something around $2 million, but since then that's been raised. Again, there's a lot of different moving parts. If you could elaborate a little bit on that, just again to help educate the uneducated business leader.
Yeah, sure, mate. Look, a couple of years ago, maybe a bit less, the Privacy Act got amended to really uplift in a huge way the maximum penalty that an organisation, a regulated entity, could be subject to under the Privacy Act for defined as a serious interference with privacy, and that's a phrase used in the legislation to link with the various obligations under the Privacy Act through the Australian privacy principles. And if you interfere with someone's privacy through your failure to comply with those principles in a serious or repeated way, the Act actually enables a final penalty, a fine to be issued, or a civil penalty, I should say, in the order of, if you can believe it, of $50 million or more, depending on the value of the actual conduct. And in the context of a data breach, that might be in the period in which an organisation suffers a data breach and doesn't actually comply with its obligations, and that might be for more than 12 months, it can actually even issue a penalty of 30% of the adjusted turnover of that organisation. So in theory, and unfortunately, we haven't seen a penalty issued yet, but there's a couple of cases at the moment that are rolling on that we could see some kind of penalty. But what you were alluding to before is those those large businesses are going to be subject to the fines that existed prior to that massive uplift in the maximum size. But
Mm.
what that means for us now is, if we see a fine issued to the
I think that's the whole point of the incident response retainer solution, what I like to call cyber insurance, because we're having businesses with good cyber potchers paying $2,500 a year for $1 million of cover, right? It's that strategy that as a whole business they're going to, and we're doing a monthly now, so right there you go. There's now looking at $200-ish a month to um, get your a plan in place, really, because like everything, or sorry, like cybersecurity, if you've done nothing, that includes cyber insurance, well then it's really going to be feeling your way out. And it's not like you ring your mates and go, "Oh, does anyone know of a good incident response team?" I've had a breach. Everyone's very taboo. They're trying to like work out where to go next. No one's going to sit down and have a 3-week tender on who wants to look after my cyber incident. So
Mm.
probably the analogy I'll finish off on, because we are over the time, is the amount of times people have a burst pipe or something, they get the emergency plumber in, they pay the fee and they go, geez, that was steep. And then they're at the barbecue and they're telling their mate and he goes, well, mate, $3,500 for what? And there was no strategy. Whereas I actually know a couple of people who have emergency plumbers, a number on the fridge, right? They know it's Kevin or Bob and he's $600. Doesn't matter what time it is. That's the rate he wants to do. They went and shopped around. And something as small as that is actually a great analogy, because if they've sort of done just a couple of things. We're not asking everyone to go to a straight full-blown cyber posture straight away, but just getting a couple of things in check will mean that you get that little leg up if something does happen.
Mm. Yeah, and I think what you've alluded to previously in other episodes, Jason, is the regulators don't want to come down hard straight away. They, again, you don't know what you don't know, but I would sense that if you're taking the right steps, and sure, you're never going to be 100%, but if you take the right steps, that will be taken into consideration compared to those who don't take the right steps and are quite clearly not doing the right thing. So I think that's also important. And look, I can't speak for the regulator, but if I was dealing with a business that came to me and said, "Hey, we are taking steps. We've done these things. We have unfortunately had a cyber incident," I go, "You know what? All good. You're doing something compared to a business that doesn't."
Yeah, the fact that there's been no final penalty issued to date, you could be cynical and you could say, what's the regulator doing? Or you could actually see it as a reflection of the fact that that they're not out there to get you. They're out there to see that organisations are trying their best to comply and uplift their security and how they're dealing with their privacy obligations. And so it's a carrot or a stick, depending on which way you want to look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Look, we are coming up to our time here, so I think we'll wrap up the episode here. Couple of key takeaways just to recap this episode. Number one, if you don't know if you're regulated or not, head to the OAIC website. The what does it stand for? The Office
The Australian
OAIC.
Information Commissioner.
That's the one. Head there,
Yeah.
and they'll have some great resources for you. Second to that, which we haven't spoke about, but it's prompted me. If you have a privacy policy on your website, it's probably a good opportunity to review what's in that. Because I will admit, when I first started my business, I was told by a web developer, you need a privacy policy on your website for the sake of satisfying Google. So there could be some big legal implications to that if you don't review your privacy policy. So do that. And then the third one, which was a great piece of advice, Jason, so thank you for this, was if you are storing PII, personally identifiable information, and you're under the $3 million threshold, it would be in your best interest to move your business alongside the Privacy Act and abide by the privacy principles in the event you have a situation. So that is fantastic. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for your time. I really appreciate it. Join us next week. We will be touching on, and we touched on it today, the topic of forensics and why cyber forensics is required in the context of a data breach, but also just to find out a little bit more about it. So be sure to tune in next week. If you have any questions, please reach out to either three of us. Would love to cover off your conversations in this podcast. All right. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Really appreciate your time. We'll end the episode there. Tune in next week. Thank you so much.